Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our amazing moderator, Jamila Mishner, Associate Professor of Government at Cornell University.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel. It's really exciting to see how many people are interested in engaging in this conversation, and we're very much excited to have you here. I am going to spend just a little bit of time, just a few moments right now, introducing our, and I literally mean this, star-studded panel. We have a really incredible panel today, and a panel that represents a wide range of sort of backgrounds and experiences, ready to give us their insights into important questions around the role of women of color in American politics today and the future of United States democracy, right? I'm going to be intentionally brief in introducing our panelists, and I say this because what it means is that I cannot do them justice. I could spend the lion's share of our time today talking about their incredible accomplishments, but I won't be able to. So I just want to flag that if you want to learn more about our panelists, we will be putting information in the chat for all of the attendees, and you can get that there. And we will also have information about them on our website, the Price Initiative website, www.priceinitiative.org. So if you want to learn more about our speakers, you should go to those places. I'll start with introducing Ilia Calderon. She is an Emmy Award-winning journalist who does things like interview Kamala Harris in her spare time and moderates debates for the presidential election. And she's also author of the book, My Time to Speak, Reclaiming Ancestry and Confronting Race. Just before we began today, actually, Ilia very kindly offered to give some of our audience members today free copies of her book. So we will use that as encouragement later on when there's an opportunity to submit questions in the Q&A. The first several people who submit questions, we will keep track of, and we'll reach out later about sending you a free book. So keep that in mind as an incentive. Next up is Shasti Conrad, who is the first woman of color to chair the Martin Luther King County Democrats in Washington State, and the founder of not one, but two organizations, Opportunity PAC and Control Z, that were founded to support Black women elected to public office in Washington State, and that aim to mobilize, in particular, Gen Z voters. And then our final panelist for today is Cheryl Laird, and she's a professor of government and legal studies at Bowdoin College. She's author, along with Ishmael White, of a recent book called Steadfast Democrats: How Social Forces Shape Black Political Behavior. And she's also published much more extensively in both scholarly and non-scholarly outlets. And so I could say much more, but I'll stop myself there. And I want to jump right in and invite our panelists, who are truly phenomenal, to jump into the deep end of the pool along with me, right? So we're going to start with, I want to say, an easy question, but none of the questions we will tackle today are easy. We've just all lived through, we've made it through 2020. Congratulations to everyone watching and to all the panelists, because it's quite a feat, honestly. It feels like making it through 2020. And of course, now we're embarking on a new year. But let's take a moment to look back. One thing that strikes me looking back is that 2020 was a banner year for women of color. From Stacey Abrams and Kamala Harris in the electoral, arena, to all of the Black and Brown and Asian women who mobilized in response to various kinds of grassroots movements, in particular in the wake of the murder of George Floyd for racial justice, to the women who have played a leading role in media in setting the terms of our political discourse, women like our own here today, Ilia Calderon. Women of color have been shaping 2020 in really distinct and striking ways. I want to invite our panelists now to tell me and to tell us in their view, what the most significant ways that women of color shaped, in particular, the outcome of the 2020 election, and even beyond the outcome, the path there, right? How have those dynamics been shaped by women of color in 2020? So any panelist that wants to jump in, you are welcome.
I want to start. Hello, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor, a pleasure. I am very humbled to be with this, amazing panelists. And you mentioned Stacey Abrams, you mentioned Kamala Harris, and I always like to go back to history. I like to go back to Harriet Tubman, to Ida B. Wells, women that fought not only for freedom, were abolitionists, but for the rights of women and Black women to vote. So the results, we can see the results of all that fight now. The fact that movies and books talk about prominent Black women, their lives, their inspiration, their motivation, those books and movies inspire women today, inspire mothers and daughters together. I remember when the primaries in Kentucky in 2020 in the summer, when it was that huge line of people that before didn't show up to vote, didn't show up because, vote suppression, and they didn't believe. But finally, they made it to the polls, and they were online, and the officers closed the doors. Everybody was banging on the doors, begging to go and vote. And when they opened the doors back, I saw women, Black women, running with kids, holding their kids, a mother with a daughter, 18-year-old daughter, voting for the first time. Those images gave me chills. It was beautiful to see how Black women were mobilized, were conscious about the value of the vote, the value of their voices. They got tired of white men deciding for their futures and the future of their families. Stacey Abrams built victory from what happened to her in 2018 when she lost. She made a remarkable, extraordinary job motivating people alongside with, this grassroots organization, Hispanics, Mi Familia, Vota, Mi Gente, that after November 3rd, came back moved from Arizona to Georgia to work and mobilize voters. So I think this is, a work that is being done for centuries, and we need to mention all the women that inspired us and inspired Kamala and inspired Stacey Abrams to do what we are doing today.
So I can go ahead and comment on the election as well. And I would say, I mean, it's ridiculously significant, right? Women of color's participation. Just as Ilya is saying, it is particularly important, I think, to bring into context the history and the battles that have been fought. And when we think about, for instance, the fact that we were celebrating the 19th Amendment and the century since the passage of it this year, when women of color were not included in that, when you have the Chinese Exclusionary Act happening at that time, Black women not being able to have access to the franchise with the passage of the Civil War amendments, when you have Latino women on the outside of that as well, when you have Native women on the outside of that as well, that the history that I think really back builds and provides women of color now this opportunity to really leverage that in this moment is in part because they have had to do so much groundwork in the absence of the franchise. They've had to do so much participation in their politics in the absence of the franchise. So being able to now vote in an election is just one piece of a bigger puzzle and a bigger narrative about the experiences of what women of color have had to deal with, because they've already become experts in all these other arenas. They've already become experts in protest politics. They've already become experts in grassroots mobilizations. You know, there's research on particularly Black women, specifically cited in that article, but I would say it goes across the board. When I teach it to my students in my Women of Color course, we talk about women, Latino women of the past who served as bridge builders, Black women who served as bridge builders, and that this often was the roles that they found themselves, not only because of limitations of the franchise, but also because of the patriarchy that existed in their own communities, right? Having to, like, Nina Otero Warren is one of my favorites to teach my students about, because she had to lie about her husband being dead in order for people to still see her as a respectable woman, for her to continue to fight the politics that she was fighting in New Mexico, to have, you know, dual language education and dual language opportunities for children in those communities. And she was using her class and leveraging her class in order to be able to make that happen. The same can be said of women in the civil rights movement. And those who often do not get acknowledged for their work and their efforts, the Fannie Lou Hamers, right, and the Ida B. Wells, and the work that they're doing on the ground, is stuff that is essential, right, for us to then come to the space of 2020 and to see that being exercised through the vote, right? Like, so all of that is building on that work. And so 2020 is significant because I think it's just one example of what we will probably be seeing in the future, right? Going forward, women of color are dominant. They are here to be heard. They are able to organize their communities. They are able to get people out to vote in significant elections, in elections where people think that there is no way that something can happen. And then it happens, like Georgia, that we just saw recently, even in Alabama, what we saw before with Doug Jones and Roy Moore. And so with that in mind, you know, I think this is just another example of what we will see going forward and what women of color will be contributing to the space, not only through electoral office and serving, but just even doing the work on the ground to get those people into the places and spaces that will speak on behalf of their concerns and their issues. And I think for women of color, there has been a long enough experience now of people in power who are not like them, that they recognize that in order for the interests that they are worried about, which, you know, I can delve deeper into that, but just in thinking about women of color and their participation, you know, there is a way that women of color broadly participate, that is very group centered, it's very community centered, and it takes away the kind of thinking and theorizing that we often do in political science about the individual choice and nature in which people participate, that it is a utility function that I am figuring out for my own individual desires. Women of color don't do that. They are actually voting with in mind their families, their communities. They are often the ones persuading and convincing people to turn out and vote. And so that is immensely important. And I think the more power and leverage they have on that, the more that both major parties will have to listen to what they have to say and really respond to it, because they hold the keys to the kingdom in many ways. And I think the reality of that is truly being seen in this election cycle.
I can jump in just to say and echo, what Ilya and Cheryl have both said, which is, I mean, building on the history. We all know this is not the first time that women of color have stepped forward to lead. Led from the beginning of time. We've led in our families, we've led in our communities, and we've led in institutions like Congress, and you go back to Shirley Chisholm in 1972 running for president. That history has been there. It's many women, particularly Black women, have paved the way. I think what made 2020 so special is the volume, and the difference that it makes when you are the first, when you are the only, versus when you're coming in with a squad, and how the power of doing it together. And I think, as Cheryl just said, women of color, we lead differently. We lead collaboratively. We lead in a way that speaks to understanding that we can't do this alone. And I think, you're seeing how, not only the how important the vote is, the number of women of color coming out to vote, the number of women running for office, but also how that shifts policies, what is brought to the table, how it shifts institutions, and also the spotlight and the support and the sort of, in some ways, it's really earth shaking of how this the country in the last year in particular has really been going through this reckoning of who are we, who do we want to be. We have to deal with our history. We cannot keep pushing racial justice underneath the rug, pretending like it's some ugly thing from the past. It is alive, and it is, unfortunately, a lot of the injustice is thriving right now. How do we fight back against that? And how do we not just put this on people of color, on women of color to do it on their own, but all of us as a society, as a community, have to reckon with the sins of the past. And women of color, I think, the last 4 years have, you hear a lot about the sort of the, revolution and the sort of pushback against uh, white nationalism, and sort of how patriarchy has really created these institutions that are not working for many people. And in 2018, there's a lot of this sort of pounding of the year of the woman. And I think in 2020, it was like women of color, Black women in particular, were like, I can't wait on anybody else. Like, I cannot leave my survival, my ability to thrive, my ability to exist. I can't leave that in anybody else's hands. And so I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna come with my full self, and we're gonna change some things up. And then there was a spotlight, and there was, with the book clubs and the protests, there was at least an understanding of like, all right, we can't look away. Now, how much everyone else is going to throw in to support women of color is an ongoing question. This is not a done, we're not done. 2020 was the start. It's not the end. So I think that's what we have to continue to look for. And then specifically just to the experience that, of what I saw in this past year and the work that I did, it's incredible, the work of the Kamala Harrises and the Stacey Abrams. But in my own home state of Washington, which is not known for a large Black population, we had a record number of 10 Black women that were running for our state legislature, and 6 of them won. And it tripled the number of Black women that we had in our state legislature. And already they just had their swearing in yesterday, and already we are seeing the change in the bills that are being brought forth. There is a Black caucus that is half women, and they are ready to really to be ambassadors and advocates for community, for family, in a way that we haven't seen before. And that happened across this country, where state legislatures, which I think in the last 4 years, we've really seen that the disinvestment in local politics and local offices contributes to the things that we all deal with nationally. It contributes to a degradation of institutions. It contributes to a lack of support for healthcare, education. All of that happens locally. And I think putting that spotlight again, and having that call to, you got to shake this up, let's run, and like, we'll support you, we'll be there. And that's why we launched Opportunity PAC, which was that we saw that there needed to be a better support system for these women, not just in asking them to run, but being there for them every step of the way while they were running, and then when they actually made it into office. And I think that's what we're seeing, is shaking that up and making the difference in this past year in 2020.
I just want to add something, because we talk about history, and the history of the Black population, of course, is longest in the United States. Imagine for immigrants, imagine for women immigrants, not only Hispanics, but from any other country, how hard it is to organizations to fight the disenfranchised and the suppression of vote, and for Hispanic women or immigrant women to start reaching or to start running for offices, for public positions, and win. So we have a long road and a huge fight ahead. We are just doing baby steps, even though, Hispanics, I think in this past election, we could show that we are, more than numbers, more than just those 60 millions. But we are, baby steps in participation in politics. We have a long road, and I think we have a lot to learn from the Black community.
Thank you for that, Ilya. And that's actually the perfect kind of segue into my next question. And I've appreciated, hearing all of the perspectives thus far. And I feel a sort of weaving in and out between thinking about this from a historical perspective and also thinking about it in a contemporary light. And I think that interaction between understanding the past as we try to comprehend the present and look forward to the future is really important. And that'll be a theme. And in fact, it is a theme for this webinar, because we're trying to grapple with the future of US democracy and the role that women of color play in it. So historically, democracy in the US has been contingent. It's been incomplete. It's been biased. It's been limited. And I hear, Ilya and Shasti and saying, that we're just beginning, right? This is the beginning of a story, or at most in the middle of a story, and certainly not the end. And indeed, one could argue that for most of its history, the US has not operated as a legitimate democracy vis-a-vis the lives of Black, Latina, Asian, and Indigenous women. Recent decades have seen substantial changes, of course, and coming decades are likely to see even more change. But persistent obstacles remain, right? So from the vantage point of your experiences, right, in newsrooms, in universities, in political organizations, and beyond, right? We have such a wide range of experiences in this panel. What obstacles do you find to be the most significant? And importantly, how do you envision them being overcome? So of course, we want to be cognizant of the obstacles. We want to have them before us and be aware of them, but then also be thinking about and envisioning what it means and what it will take to overcome those obstacles. So I wonder if our panelists can comment on that.
So I would say that one of the obstacles that I think we have seen, but and we're starting to see progress being made is just people running, right, that are women of color. I think that's one of the big ones, is the belief that you are competent enough, able enough, capable enough to run. I think, again, going just back to your first question, and I thought about it a little more and it relates back to this one, is one of the most significant things of 2020, honestly, is the election of Donald Trump in 2016. I think that the idea that a man who has no electoral experience can find himself as president of the United States speaks volumes to anybody who has ever questioned their capability or ability, or not having the qualifications to try to dream of and aspire to and run for higher office. Like I have no empirical data on it now, but I'm sure that there were probably many women in particular who looked in the mirror and thought to themselves, well, if he can win, I should try, at least, because like he had no experience, like for good or for bad, from whatever aisle side of you sit on, he by definition had no electoral experience in the traditional manner. And so when I talk about this with many of my students, and one of the things we use is this book called Contested Transformation by Pei Lin, Hardy Fanta, Pender Hughes, of several scholars of women of color in political science. And they talk about, this contested transformational space that women of color find themselves in. And one of those things that often serves as a hindrance and a challenge for women of color is, these traditional paths of becoming politicians, right? That there are expectations about what personal attributes you will have, what kinds of characteristics you will have, what kind of background and pedigree you will have, and that this is how you gain entrance. So when we think, for instance, about like the Kennedy dynasty, they are like the peak optimal, imagine thinking of like a family dynasty in politics. Like they've been political, they stayed political, they've networked in the right networks, they went to the right schools, they were in the good old boy network. And so they had access to opportunity, things that were kept away from women of color that you would have never been able to gain entrance on. And so these things then serve as hurdles for women of color to then enter the space, because they're often in occupations that don't offer those types of opportunities. They're often dealing with caretaking demands that are significantly higher even to their white female counterparts. They are often dealing with challenges in terms of educational resources, let alone the societal constraints that are created from their race and gender identity. That simple intersectional marginalization and what that does in putting you in this space in which you're not quite deemed woman enough, and you're also not quite deemed like a person of color enough, because we define those things within these paradigms in which it's Black men are dealing with something. Although it is Black women who organize the Black Lives Matter movement, it is Black women who are on the ground protesting for that, but people aren't doing that in the same regard for Black women who are killed by police, right? Like we don't necessarily see that at the same degree, at the same level, even with the instances in which we have seen at high levels, like things around Breonna Taylor, we just don't really see that. And so I think that that is one of the significant hurdles, is for people to feel like they should feel qualified to run. And if they don't feel qualified to run, that you can do something in your community, right? And that you are capable of literally getting a van or getting people together. And if it means that you're just handing out water while people stand in line, or if you are able to organize people to inform them about politicians, or if you're able to do the everyday conversations with family members about their politics and try to explain to them why you want to vote in certain ways or why you may not want to vote in certain ways, and understanding that, I feel like women of color are in that space of the bridge work. But it is still a hurdle because societally and systemically, these structures are designed in a way that are quite prohibitive for women of color to be successful. When I think about things like Tammy Duckworth coming in a wheelchair with her child on the congressional floor, and that was the first time. And I'm like, in New Zealand, the prime minister went and had a baby and came back. It's like, I'm literally in office birthing a child, and here I am back on the floor. And yet, it was like a celebrated moment when Tammy Duckworth came out with her child. Like, how did we get this far in our politics that we could be in the 21st century and celebrating the moment a child is on the floor of Congress? Like, we really need to think about, why is that limited? Why are those constraints there? And, with more women and women of color in office, I think what we will see is a shift in policy. And I think even the pandemic has truly opened up the door for us to recognize, well, all this stuff we said we can't do, we can, and we can make room for, and we can accommodate. And if that is able to sustain itself over time, I think that that could also help to deal with some of these challenges and hurdles that are facing women of color for those spaces.
I want to say something, because I'm gonna, after my small participation here, I have to excuse myself for 5 minutes, or 3 minutes. I need to record my translation for the story, for the interview. So I have to go and come back. But I want to add about what Cheryl was saying, that is true. Like, how can we get to this point when lack of participation of women and women of color is normal, and people still thinking there is no problem, that it's okay because it's been that way for our entire lives. You mentioned how everybody was surprised that the prime minister took, her child to the prime minister of New Zealand. And I want to mention when I became the first Black woman to anchor a news show in Colombia for the first time, and this was in 1997, for the first time. And for the first time in the United States, and this was in 2017, in Hispanic media. I remember when they were organizing the announcement, I didn't want to, because I think it shouldn't be announce in that way, because I still dream with that day where these achievements are normal because we all have the same opportunities. It shouldn't be. I mean, it is a reason, and I don't want to diminish or say that it was not a great achievement. It was. But the way we are celebrating our achievements is because there are not enough, because of the lack of opportunities, because of the lack of participation, because kids like me in Colombia, I never saw someone on TV that looked like me doing something important and a main role, being a news anchor, being the main role of a telenovela. Never. So it was not even in my dreams to do what I'm doing today. When before, like right after my announcement of as a main anchor in Univision, one of my colleagues, a cameraman from Colombia, was here with his daughters. And as soon as I opened the door of the makeup room coming to the studio, he said, like, look at her. She is the one that I told you. She was asking her father why she didn't see anyone that looks like her on Univision screen. That day I cried. And that day I understood that it was important to make this announcement. But in my dreams, I still picture one day when it's just normal because we are a lot, because we have the opportunities to study, because we have the opportunity to be hired, because people believe in diversity, because people think that diversity is actually good for corporations and is good for newsrooms. And when we go out and talk about stories and what happened in May and June with the Black Lives Matters, the lack of context made us, and made our Hispanic media to just follow what the authorities were saying. We learned from that mistake. The company learned from that mistake. The company, listened to criticism, and now Univision has, a program and plans to include and to work with universities to have diversity in our newsroom and people that can tell our stories the way we have lived it, because no one else lived the stories the way we lived it. No one else can tell a story like the person that crossed the border, for example, or the journalist that was right there when that person crossed the border. That's why diversity is important. And I still dream where we have, we all have the same opportunities. And this is just normal. This is just, a woman that, studied and worked hard and achieved this position. And not a huge announcement, because I am the first Black woman to anchor a main Hispanic news show in the United States. I'm going to excuse myself for 2 minutes. I have to record my voice in Spanish and I'll be back, okay?
No problem. The multitasking of a working woman, right? It's nice to actually incorporate that into our practice, even when we're doing a webinar like that. It's all right. We were talking beforehand, like we all got kids in the background. What if they run on screen? It's all right. We're gonna keep it rolling and do what we do. Shasti, do you wanna respond to this question about obstacles?
Yeah, and I can be brief and quick about it. I mean, there was one key point Ilya said on the last question about voter suppression. One of the lines that has stuck with me that came out of Georgia was that Georgia was not a red state. Georgia was a voter suppressed state. And so when you start to lift up those barriers that have been put in place to keep people of color out, and from poll taxes and voting tests and all of those ways in which the structures and barriers were put in place to ensure white supremacy and white control of institutions, you start to remove those barriers because there's a spotlight on them, and then oftentimes it is people like Stacey Abrams putting their bodies on the line to say, you know what, like, we're not doing this anymore. I'm sick and tired of having to watch as, it impacts me and the work I do, but also my community. And I know that this isn't right, and so I'm gonna do everything I can and do a full stand to try to change that. I think that's really key. And I mean, we can talk all day about all the various institutional and structural barriers that there are in place. I also think that Cheryl was making a really important point around some of those informal barriers that come up that keep women of color, particularly, out of leadership roles. Um, Imposter syndrome is a very real thing. There was the data point that, for to run for office, you have to ask, on average, you have to ask a woman 7 times before she will actually consider it and think, maybe that could be a path for me. It is almost double that for women of color. I ran for state senate in 2016 to fill a vacancy left by Pramila Jayapal, who had just been elected to Congress. And, I remember it took months of so many friends and family being like, I really think you should think about this. Like, I think you should run. And I waited until almost like a week and a half before the election because I kept thinking somebody else better would step forward, that there had to be somebody else because it couldn't be me. I didn't know enough. I wasn't, I didn't have the right relationships, there were so many reasons that I had in my head. And then when I ran, I got all the questions of, are you experienced enough? Are you ready enough? I often think for women, we go from you're too young to you're too old in, like, at 35. It happens overnight where you wake up and all of a sudden it's like, whatever excuse it is to try to keep you out. And so I had all the, like, you're too young, or we don't know you, or I also had the, you're not married, you don't have children, how do we know that you're reliable and that that someone else has evaluated you for us. There were all kinds of those types of questions while I was running, and to deny the, like, just the emotional impact of having to feel those types of questions that I know my male counterparts and my white counterparts were not having to deal with. They weren't getting asked those types of questions. They were getting asked policy questions, and they were getting asked about, some of their work experience, which I would have loved to be able to talk about, but I had to go through all the layers of, well, we're not sure about you, and are you ready, and you'll be the first, and all of that. So I do think we have to look at both the structural aspects, but also the ways in which we just engage in this work together, and how we support, how we think about women of color moving into these leadership roles, and really that support of, see something, say something. If you're around and you're at a candidate forum, or you're in an endorsement interview, or you're going through that, and you start to hear some of those questions coming out directed to women of color candidates, to be like, hey, we're not doing that. We're going to make sure we ask the same questions that are substantive, no matter who it is, so that we can get to the point of it being equitable, and we don't have to do this, like, what does it feel to be the first one? And we can just talk about the issues, which is what we all would love to be able to do.
Whew. All right, getting down to the nitty gritty and keeping it really real. I just appreciate our panelists for that. And so much of this is resonating, of course, with respect to our larger, political world, but also in many ways, even beyond that, right? These issues go deep and are experienced in so many realms of our lives. And then we bring that with us when we come into the political world, which explains a lot of those different challenges and baggages, at least on the individual level that we've been talking about. Never mind the structural level, right? That awaits even once you overcome those individual level challenges. It's difficult not to ask this next question, given where we are, the very specific and particular political moment that we're in, right? And it's a different moment than if we had had this panel last Tuesday, right? It feels like a different moment because we have just experienced an insurrection, right? And an insurrection that wasn't racially neutral, right? But instead was rife with all sorts of racial meaning and weight and implications, and even more directly with racism. And so we're living in a historically divisive, tumultuous, I would go so far as to say dangerous political moment. And as women of color, and we span the gamut of that category, which is a capacious and diverse category, I want to ask you all about what this moment means for you in terms of the different kinds of work that you do when it comes to reporting, when it comes to talking about and engaging politics, when it comes to thinking about the role that you'll play in political life, whether it's from the vantage point of discourse or research or direct political action, right? We're each engaging in different ways, but all doing it in this historically divisive and tumultuous time. And what does that mean for you all, for the work that you do? How do you process what it is that you do, given the world that we're facing, right? That became so utterly and painfully clear to us, even in this past week.
Um, so I would say that it speaks right into the work that I do. So even prior to the insurrection, I have been discussing with my department and thinking about what I was at, like, months before I went on leave, but I was thinking about, whether going to teach a white identity politics course. In my idea of that was, we teach Black politics, we teach Latino politics, we teach Asian politics, and they're referred to as such. And then we teach Intro to American Government. And so, and that's like everything else, but not that. And so my idea was, I need to put that front and center. I think I spend so much of my class when I teach on race, and I think people come in with an expectation that it's going to be just talking about disparity. It's always in the glass half full type of framework, right? Like that people of color are behind, people of color are in deficit, people of color are in this, people of color are in that. And the framing of that, I think, oftentimes then directs the narrative in a way that there is something individually wrong with them, that they are the ones at fault for their own circumstances, and that this is not speaking to structural inequalities that stem directly from, right, ways in which we uplift white identity and the way that white identity has been allowed to be so pervasive, ubiquitous, powerful, dominant, and defining of what is the baseline normal in our society. And so I am more encouraged with teaching that class. I've been like gathering materials from what I just saw with this insurrection, in addition to other works that I want to bring to bear with that discussion. In addition to my own research, I've done work on the idea of what happened when Barack Obama was elected to the presidency and people started using this rhetoric about post-racial. And what does that do when people want to be post-racial? What does that notion even mean for someone to be post-racial? Like, you see that I'm Black, we see that we are all Black, like we are all, like we are Black, we are Afro-Latina, like we are women of color. No one is going to look at us and not think that. So the idea that post-racial is even a narrative that becomes so dominant and prominent under his tenure, right, his administration, I think is one that speaks already to the challenges that I think the white community struggle with when it comes to race, because for them, trying to deal with racism in many ways often means that we should just ignore it. We should be colorblind. We should imagine a world where race is no longer something we need to think about. I definitely need you to think about this, right? Like that type of directionality in how we should go about addressing racial inequity and racial issues and racial policy is not one in which I don't want you to see my race or imagine a world where it's no longer relevant. It is one that you should think about as very defining to my lived experience, very defining to my worldview, very defining to how I then see what I will do when I engage in politics. And so I think it's important to point out those moments of where white identity shapes the lens of how you're understanding the political space. And I think we need to be explicit in saying that it's white identity. It was white insurrectionists that happened on the 6th. They were there with white nationalism. They were there speaking about an issue of feeling threatened as white individuals by what they believe is a racial threat that has come about by the outcome of this election and the loss of their person that they were supporting, right, which was the president. And that the president was part of this, right? Like we have to be willing to say it. And I think in my work, I'm trying to be more direct in doing that. Even in the book that I wrote, I posted this out on Twitter not too long ago, like in the last couple of days. But in the end conclusion, Ishmael and I speculate about this idea that we put forth in the book about racialized social constraint, which is essentially why do Black people vote for Democrats? Well, that the process of voting for the Democratic Party is not limited to some individualized behavior, but is in fact a social dynamic that is going on within the community, and that is informed by social norms and also expectations and the ability to sanction people who decide to kind of dissuade away from that expectation. Hold on one second. Hi, bud. Do you want to come speak to all my people? Right. He's made an appearance. So the idea that that would be used then potentially by many people within the white population as part of some of what has gone on with the Republican Party, which is something that we've seen with the growth of the Southern strategy being utilized, the explicit references to race that's being utilized, and the umbrella that then captures of people who fall under the category of voting for Trump, but also may not embody principles that maybe the Republican Party wants to associate itself with, but have now fallen into the umbrella because they are putting in this lockstep loyalty around an individual that has this problematic administration and how he has gone about, how he's navigated it, run it, and even spoken about this electoral outcome. So I think it's something you have to speak about. Like, we have to say it. We have to say where it's coming from, where the history of it is. And I think we need more books and literature and media coverage that really talk about that in ways that are uncomfortable for some, but I think have to be addressed, because for people of color to watch that kind of thing happen and to not see a response akin to what we've seen happen to our own communities, like what we see to people happening on the border, what we see happening at other instances of unrest, for instance, for Native communities trying to fight for their rights, right? How we think about that really is key. And whiteness is going to be something that we have to talk about.
And I think too, that, oh, Jamila.
Oh no, go for it, Shasti. I was just gonna say one thing as we roll along. I wanna remind folks to put their questions in the Q&A. So even as you're hearing Cheryl and Shasti and Ilya speak, whatever this is sparking for you, anything that you want us to address as we enter into Q&A in the next 10 minutes or so, make sure to get it in there while you can. And the first, so I don't know, however many people who do submit a question will get Ilya's book. So I just wanted to say that, but Shasti, please take the floor.
I was just gonna say too, I mean, yes, like we are in an incredibly dangerous period, which people of color particularly have been yelling for the last like 4 years and beyond. I remember when when Trump won in 16, about like I really was terrified of the direction that we were going, and what we saw last Wednesday was a part of what I was really terrified about, and that um it's not equal. Like, so often I've been seeing this, there's been this moral equivalence coming from particularly the Republican Party about like, well, there were protesters for Black Lives Matter over the summer, and we're just protesting and using our voices too. It's not the same. What they are protesting is the results, not what they are rioting, what they are moving forward in sedition and insurrection is for a free and fair election that ended up in a result that they don't like. What Black Lives Matter was about was that Black and brown bodies are being murdered, not are being murdered through state violence. That is what is occurring. They're not on the even playing field. I think the other thing to really say is that although always, 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 it is Black and brown people that face the consequences in much more dire consequences and in much greater volume than white people. white people are also being hurt and are in dangerous scenario with what happened on Wednesday and what is likely planned for next week, and what will continue to happen. This is about democracy, upholding democracy, and being able to have a semblance of a life that we believed would be safe here in this country. And white people are suffering those consequences too. I have, in the last several years, have really focused more on supporting really progressive candidates, not just people of color, but really progressive candidates who are a lot of people of color, because progressive policies benefit communities of color more than other policies. And I like to try to move us into race and class solidarity, because the more that we see that the ways in which the rules are written differently for the wealthy, for the elite, the ways in which that impacts brown and black communities, but also white communities, also marginalized people within the white identity, that will hopefully help us to the only way we fight against this is if we do it together, and if white people can use their privilege and the power that they have, but from their racial identity, to be able to shine the spotlight and to say, we are not going along with this. We don't want to continue to push and support, and although I hate the the sort of overlay fawning over the like sort of Mitt Romneys of the world, I do think it's important because it signals to other white people, particularly conservative white people, that this is not normal, that this is not okay, and that this is not something you want to be in solidarity with over a racial identity. You want to be on team democracy. And then that needs to be listening and being led by black and brown people, but that's where you want to go. And I think that's what's really, we are in an incredibly important moment as to whether or not this experiment called democracy is going to last. And we need white people to also separate from this rhetoric, this insurrection, these types of violence, and say, all right, we see it and we're coming over with you all.
You have to unmute, Ilya. There.
Okay. Then my experience is a little bit more complex in a process of education as a person and as a professional. And, you know, as a media, and I'm talking about my Univision where I work. When I came to the United States, I had to face this this complex decision that I needed to make, because people were putting me in different boxes. Because sometimes I was too black to be Hispanic, or too Hispanic to be black. And I found myself in that, you know, problem of not being an Afro-Latina defined as an Afro-Latina, meaning my race is black and my culture is Hispanic. I am both, and I'm proudly both. And with our audience, it was a little bit more complex, and we've been seeing this in the past years. We were always so focused on immigration because it's one of the biggest problems our audience in the Hispanics in the United States face. But we didn't see before how the African American problems affects us the same way. When you say you all talk and we all talk and we say black and brown, we put our communities together, but our communities were not together. This has been an enormous and long process of our Hispanic audience understanding that racism is not normal. Racism migrates with us here to the United States. In every single country in Latin America, from Argentina to Mexico, going through the islands, where we have people enslaved, there is racism, and it is normal. The microaggressions about the hair, about the hips, about the woman, about the accent, the culture, the clothes, everything is so normal in our countries that when immigrants come to the United States, they try to distance themselves from the Black community. And we all have one purpose, and it's social justice. We shouldn't be together before in this fight. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. always included immigrants in his fight. John Lewis, always, he was arrested fighting for immigrants' rights in front of Capitol Hill. And he was proud to be arrested because he was defending the cause of the immigrants. So for our audience, it's been a process of education and understanding that when white people discriminate us, when the system, the past 5 years, made the gap deeper and deeper between the white folks and immigrants and African Americans, we need to understand that we need to fight that fight together. We can't be, separate. This is not, when I interviewed the leader of the KKK in 2017, people ask me like, why are you going? Why is Univision sending you just to interview someone that you know is going to insult you? But it was a part of educating our community about something that affects us as well, in the same way, the exact same way. If we're immigrants marching to Capitol Hill, the response would have been different, would have been different for Black folks. So my conclusion is that we need to fight together. We need to be together. We need to understand. We need to educate ourselves about the history of the other communities that are, in the same fight. We can't do this separate. We have to do it together.
Thank you for that, Ilia. And one of the things that I love about webinars like this is that we invite people who we think are incredible and who have experiences that we think will allow them to contribute really informative perspectives, but we don't know what anyone's going to say, right? We didn't all conspire before this to map out exactly what was going to be said. But incredibly enough, I think so much of what has emerged, especially in these last few comments, reflects something that's really at the core of the Press Initiative, right? We're about the politics of race, immigration, class, and ethnicity. And we want to think about those intersections and other kinds of intersections, right? Which is, today we're talking about women of color because we realize that gender is an important part of a set of intersections that shapes life, gender and race for so many people. But of course, your immigration status matters as well. And of course, thinking about, for example, cross-class mobilization, even across cross-racial mobilization that implies some of the different class formations that Shasti talked about. And Ilia said, it's complicated, right? It's complicated. It depends on who your audience is, on what your goals are. And we've only began to sort of scratch the surface of some of the complexities here, but I've really valued the perspectives of our panelists thus far. One of the things that I want to do is to transition us to talking about some of the questions that the audience has prompted us to consider. And we'll start with an audience question from Margaret Brower, who is actually somebody who I know and think is incredible, just as an aside. And the question says, I really appreciate attention to current support systems, and even Shasti talking about Opportunity PAC, for example, that gave women of color resources that they needed to effectively mobilize the vote in 2020, right? And I think along the way, all of our panelists have mentioned these kinds of resources and institutions. But Margaret asked, what would you say are the support systems needed now to retain, protect, and support women of color who are now in these positions, right? So they're one set of institutions and resources that sort of get us there. And perhaps there's another set that a different kind or corresponding kinds of support and resources that will be necessary to sort of retain and I think this is really important and protect women as they enter into and they exercise these various roles, right? So I wonder if our panelists might speak to that.
Yeah, I would, if I can jump in, I'd say that once you become an elected official, you both have a spotlight and a platform, but you also there's ways in which you get hemmed in because you have to be able to get bills like through the system with which you're trying to work in, and you're trying to get you're hearing from your community, and then you've got all the power structures that are within the legislative body that you're trying to work in. And so one of the things that we realize is, we started out as Opportunity Pack, that it was really, it was about helping to raise funds to support candidates and to do that work. But that it didn't end. Those relationships that we built while they were running for office, it doesn't end once they get there. In fact, they need the support in helping to give them the cover from community to be able to push initiatives that maybe are oftentimes seen by their peers as like, oh, that's just like a pet issue, like, oh, that's about, how do we support Black families in our community, or like with COVID, the rates for Black people in this country are so much higher. The death rates from COVID are so much higher for Black people in this country. So therefore, when we're trying to pass a big stimulus package, or we're trying to help in the ways of around COVID, that we have a part of it that says, well, we're going to bookmark some particular funds to go towards helping the Black community who's being impacted a lot more than other communities. Well, then they start to work through that system, and then you've got even people within their own party who are saying, well, no, we can't make it too specialized because we're going to get critiqued in this way, and it's going to make it harder for me to run in my district that's more purple, and so I don't want that pet issue in there. And so they're battling in all those different ways once they're in office. So how do we help in the media? How do we help with bringing in people who will testify in the legislature? How do we help with getting stories about how this impacts, to be able to help give them the sort of support to be able to demonstrate, and the data? And we have to make sure that we can show that these policies are data informed. I think also helping to build out, like, that they're not alone, that they don't have to take on these battles by themselves, that not only in with their fellow elected officials, but also that the community will be there and will not judge them if there's a misstep, or if they don't get everything done that they were expected to get done. That there is a humanizing of, we get that this is hard, we get that there are additional challenges by being a woman and a woman of color in these institutional spaces. And so I think, building that is really key. And then, paying attention and being a part of that work, because a lot of times we all, after an election cycle, we all go back to our lives and sort of like let the elected officials go do their thing. And there are no off years. Every year we have to be focused on both on who's running for office, but also like what they're doing when they get there, and how do we create a soft landing sometimes for when it gets really hard and really, really challenging.
I agree with Shasti on many of the things that would be helpful, and I think one, obviously funding is something that we think about a lot, like just the power of the purse and investing in these women, and often that women of color find themselves disproportionately less likely to have as much campaign donations and funds in their pocket to run for instance, reelection. Like we often don't think about like, oh, that person won the first election, like they have to get reelected, and so that's a major factor that they're going to be up against. I think there's mentorship that needs to happen, and that speaks a lot to like where mentorship can come from. I think there's mentorship that could be happening within legislatures, within city councils. When you think about the hurdles that certain people find themselves up in, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just comes to mind because she's been the most vocal about it. But that recent piece she had in the New York Times talking about how she almost didn't run again. I think says a lot, because someone who is as high profile as her, someone who is a power player at a very junior status within Congress, to be saying that the heat that she has taken for her mere existence in Congress, you don't have to necessarily agree with her policy, but for the critique to come down that millennials often are not politically active, young people aren't politically active, and then to have a young woman literally do that and be active, to then be criticized for it because you don't agree with certain things. I mean, we don't agree with a lot of what these older white men do either, but we don't let them get them kind of hits, right? Like that, this comes down on her. And so to have the position and the ideas in the legislators' mind that they need to mentor their peers, even peers who don't look like them, that those women of color who know that they're going into Congress, that often even, or in the legislatures or city councils, then maybe some of the mentorship that they may need may not come from a person of color. It may come from a white male colleague who may not be the best friend that you need, but will be the person you need when you need to get some policy done, when you need to figure out how to negotiate those dealings that aren't really written out in the rule book, but really have to do with being in the right location, being at the right function, being in the right spaces, that you can get the leverage that you need. And I think that that's something that can be taught early on to women of color, those who are going to potentially become the people who would run for office, is this idea that how the systems operate often are in ways that are quite informal, that create a lot of challenges and hurdles for women of color, because those informal spaces are ones that we may not be as familiar with. And so the better that we can come in with that level of navigation, the better off that we can be. So, invite your legislators to some of those spaces. Like if you're having functions, I can't tell you in Maine here how many times I've been offered an opportunity to come to like a tea or a little like house party to meet a candidate. And I was like, oh, this is what y'all be doing. Like I literally was, because I'm living in a fairly white state. And I was like, oh, and I'm on the list because I'm affiliated with Bowdoin. I'm seen as someone high profile, but like that's a regular thing. The tea parties are a regular thing, these little functions. So if you can put together a function to introduce a woman of color legislator to your peers, to people who have dollars or ideas or willing to support them, bring them, because we often aren't invited and we don't even know those spaces are happening. So I think that those are the big ways.
Do you want to say something, Shazzy?
I was just gonna say, no, I agree 100%, and I sometimes forget that it's so true that like that those informal networks and those teas, the happy hours, all of that stuff that like everybody was having, that we as women of color we didn't make the list, and how important that is. And when I think about the fundraising part of it, both for candidates, but you're absolutely right about the re-election space of it. I had one of our Black women candidates said to me, she went to like an Emerge candidate training, and they said, well, start fundraising out of your own network, go to your family and your friends. But particularly for black people, Black women, this woman said, my community's struggling. There isn't intergenerational wealth. When you're asking me to go to my network, you're asking me to go to people who are struggling and ask them for money. And that's just, I can't do that. And they will give what they can, but it's different than, the networks where, people are able to write $10,000 checks without blinking an eye. And so absolutely, Cheryl's absolutely right about like helping to network for women of color, helping to make the asks. It's so hard. Women of color, we're not trained to talk about money, or ask for money or advocate for ourselves in a lot of ways. So if you have those relationships and can help with making those types of asks, that's huge. I mean, it changes everything, and it helps to also train other people that they can give money to women of color candidates.
I'm so glad that you both are talking about this and how can we support each other, because I always had the idea to launch a scholarship, and I was thinking about like, I support 250 kids in my hometown in Chocó in Colombia, in elementary school, but I wanted to do something for women that want to participate in politics. Women, Black and brown women that have the interest and are eager to participate and be part of the change. And I was attending a summit that takes place every year. It's called One Young World. And it's a summit where young leaders from all over the world come together. When around 2,000 young leaders from all over the world come to one city, and we reunite, and we talk to them. And there are people, giving speeches, and Kofi Annan was one of the big supporters of One Young World. We have, any type of leaders in every single aspect you can imagine: social equality, LGBTQI plus, water, environmental, everything. And I decided that is, the best way to give a woman a tool is through a scholarship, through an organization that is going to give that woman an opportunity to have the relationships to start building a network that she can use in the future to participate in politics and be part of a change. So I am glad that we, the three of us, we all believe in, the way women have to support each other.
Yeah, so much in each of these responses. I'm gonna move because we have so many questions. We got a burst of questions in the
I have a new show that I need to prepare.
Exactly. So we have to finish on time, but so we will not. I want to apologize to the audience because we won't possibly get to all the questions in the Q&A, but we'll do what we can just in the next few minutes and then wrap up. We have a question from Shannon Gleason that I wanted to ask because it's really important and it's challenging, and I think there are a lot of challenging pieces of this conversation, and it's crucial to kind of confront them head on. So Shannon asked how we might think about the difference between demographic, or what some political scientists would call descriptive, and substantive representation, right? And so she talks about the pressure we put on women of color to speak for every woman of color, but also the reality that we don't always have the same doors open for them. So she says Kamala Harris will no doubt work against the interest of many, perhaps even most women of color, but yet her election is historic and it should be celebrated. So how do we lift the voices of our electeds but not let them off the hook, right? How do we celebrate these advances, right? Having a vice president who is a woman of color, but also be ready to sort of bring critique to bear and be cognizant of the difference between descriptive representation, we share a similar skin tone, and really substantive representation, the kind of interest of women of color being advanced in really concrete and substantive ways. So maybe we can do like 1 minute from each panelist just so that we can keep it moving.
I would say that one way would be to have an awareness, those people having an awareness that they will be held accountable in some way. And I think for Harris, for example, she was somebody who is fairly moderate, I think, relative to other women of color, but like progressive fellow to her white colleagues. But we should think about that she needs women of color to be there with her to even attempt to try to win the presidency. And so this is a time then to bring what she needs to be hearing front and center, make it public, make it clear, make it known, write letters to her office, put things out in op-eds, make it known that that is something that she should be responding to, because if they can't hear the criticism, it will make it difficult to hold them accountable. And I know we also don't want to drag people through the mud and make them look bad, make the community look bad, make women look bad. And so that becomes a big challenge. But you need to be public about this. So I think specifically about a Black woman who recently died, who was a doctor, who was infected with COVID, who openly spoke about racism at the hospital where she was being tended to. And I saw Harris respond to her. I literally saw a Facebook post from Harris's organization, like from her official Facebook, speaking specifically to this woman's concerns and specifically to what's going on in Black women's health. So without putting it out there, we will put ourselves at a disadvantage. And it does mean that sometimes the looks and the optics of it may not be as we want it to be, but it is necessary to make people understand where they need to position themselves and what they represent for the community and what the community is expecting of them.
I just want to jump in and say that Ilya actually has to leave because she has a job anchoring a news show. So it's sort of important, and she's sort of.
Sorry, I swear I have, the time enough to be here, but how am I going to say no to an interview with Kamala Harris, right? So I had to.
No.
And I just finished what we are going to air at 6:30, and I need to go to the editing process and be present. So thank you. It was an honor to talk to you. I actually feel like I was with them in a panel. I am so proud of you, and it was an honor to speak with you and to be in this panel. Thank you so very much. And this fight needs to keep going, and we are on top of the wave. We need to keep going. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you to the audience, and I will send the books. Okay. Thank you.
Sounds
bye.
Good. An event is a success when one of the panelists is coming off the heels of an interview with Kamala Harris and is nonetheless excited about the conversation that we've been having here, right? So Shasti, I just want to give you a chance to quickly respond to this question if you wanted
Yep.
to, and then we'll move on and try to maybe get one or so more audience question before we run out of time.
Yeah, real quickly, I'll just say, like, one of the nice things is that there's been more conversation about women of color and women of color in politics, there have been more of these types of panels and presentations, and there's a sisterhood, I think, that's developing amongst those of us who get to talk about these issues, and I just think it's so cool that, like, Cornell University would help to do that. So, you're changing the whole system by giving us space to be able to talk to each other and get to know one another, so thank you for that. I will just say quickly that, one of the things that I think is that both is happening in what we need to do is moving the conversation from strictly identity politics to value politics. So when we start to be able to give room to, to candidates, elected officials, particularly people of color, women of color, and allow them space to be able to talk about values, the issues that they care about, and not just have to talk as the ambassadors of an entire population, an entire sort of community that is expansive. We would never ask that. It's like we're not looking at Joe Biden to represent all white men over 70. We don't expect that of him. And so it's not really fair to expect that for Kamala Harris either, or for Stacey Abrams. They are on an incredible spectrum of ideas and perspectives and lived experience, and being a Black woman or person of color is one part of who they are, and leading by values helps us to be able to leave room for the different shades of those experiences that I think is really key. I think the election results from in November really tell us too that the Latinx population in Florida is different than the Latinx population in Arizona. The Black community in Georgia is different than the Black community here in Washington State. And then within those populations, it's different within that. The AAPI community often doesn't get discussed, but my God, the diversity within AAPI and their experiences of immigration and what they bring back and their connections to home country, all of that leads to different places along the political spectrum. And so when we do everyone a disservice when we just talk about the Black vote or these Black candidates or this it's not fair. And I think we've got to move forward to give people space to bring their full selves, which is a set of all kinds of places on sort of conservatism to progressivism.
Okay, so I'm gonna end with one final question here, and it actually combines a couple of different questions. And I just wanna say, even though there are plenty of questions we won't be able to get to, I wanna thank the folks who have who have submitted questions, because they're really fabulous questions that are really substantively engaging with the conversation and taking us to different arenas. And it's just really incredible to see how engaged and how thoughtful our audience is. But this question combines a couple of different questions that we've gotten about thinking about, part of the theme, right? We're trying to think about US democracy, and we've talked about sort of the history of that democracy, and we're also trying to think through the future. And so, I noted in one of the early questions that I asked that democracy, the various ways in which US democracy was flawed, particularly from the vantage point of the experiences of women of color. And one questioner, Sid Tarot, said that, yes, US democracy has always been flawed, but perhaps we're moving from a state of that democracy being flawed to something deeper than that, a crisis in democracy. And perhaps that crisis requires us to focus on allying with other groups, right? For the purposes of sort of saving democracy in this point of crisis, right? But Alice, another questioner, raises a different and I think disturbing possibility and a different take here, right? Which is that the US is actually in a process of democratization right now. In other words, becoming a full and real democracy really for the first time. And the kind of role of women of color, the roles that we've been able to occupy increasingly so, represent that. And that the kind of invasion, as a colleague of mine said to me last week, which I really loved, our insurrection that we saw last week, is really a kind of white male supremacist violent reaction to that democratization, right? And under that view, it's not so much that democracy has always been flawed, but now we're in crisis. But that democracy has always been in crisis and perhaps not even fully democracy. And now we're pushing back against that reality. And what we're seeing is a violent response, right? And I wonder if you all would respond to these different possibilities, and also more broadly, think about what a movement for racial justice and a movement to sort of advance democracy in the US looks like in the context of these larger ways of thinking about these issues.
Uh, so I think there's a lot there, right? And like in thinking about, this is definitely a growing pain, right? Like I think we're in the middle of some growing pains, and we're witnessing how it manifests itself. If people are interested in a book I recently just read, but it was called Mediocre: The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America by Ijeoma Oluo. And I thought her book was excellent in that it really brings to bear how much of our politics and how much of our foundations have been defined by the privileging of whiteness, and particularly white men, and also the harm that is created for many of them, right? That this has created a standard and expectation of how democracy is supposed to operate for them in a way that is going to be challenging once you start to allow for democracy to really be accessible to those who have often found themselves disenfranchised or not being able to access these spaces. So, I mean, I think we're in a growing pains period. And I do lean to the side that we have never truly been a democracy, right? When half of your population can't vote until the 19th Amendment, for instance, and even then that only includes white women, when Black people can't vote until the passage of the Civil War amendments, when Natives can't vote until the passage of another, like when 18-year-olds can't vote until the passage of another. I mean, like when you start to think about, and even now when you do allow for certain people to vote, and then the suppression that comes about. So the voter suppression that's gone on for those who are former felons finding themselves disenfranchised in Florida. Right, what we are hearing already coming into state legislatures in response to the 2020 election results, right, and these attempts to suppress votes potentially by altering absentee ballots. And so it is a long journey, and I think we have to think about how we see ourselves involved in it, that the racial justice that can be involved in it can come in numerous ways. Grassroots efforts in particular, I think, will be key to all of this, and that they're often underestimated because they don't fit the formal types of patterns and spaces and organizations that we typically see. So people sit here and they wonder why LaTosha Brown and why Black Voters Matter worked so well, why Stacey Abrams' program worked so well. And instead of just thinking about that this seems to be anomalous, and I'm like, no, this is the way, this is the path, and we need to be replicating this in every state, right? If we truly want to get this to happen and make sure everyone is registered, everybody knows what they need to be doing for the vote, that understands it regardless of where they fall, but that we need to truly push for that democratic practice, because we have yet to truly achieve it, and we will see pushback more and more as we go along with it.
Yeah, and let me end on this, which is, you know, as we get past the first, right, as we get past the sort of just the entry points and the like applause around, oh, simply people are there, we get to talk about the differences in leadership styles. I'm also reading Mediocre, which is a great book by one of our hometown favorites, Ichioma Alo, who's from Seattle. And exactly that, like, women of color, we're gonna lead differently. So I ask is, will you let us lead, and will you be led by us? Will you not just let us in the door, but will you actually follow where we're going to go? Will you do it differently? Will you allow us to do it differently, to build different types of bridges, to work collaboratively? Though a white patriarchal style of leadership is often one that is a zero-sum game. It is top down. And what I'm seeing over and over again is, because of how women of color have had to exist and survive in this country, is that we knew that our humanity is tied into others. And so the way in which we lead is going to be different. And will you let us? And lastly, the other organization that I founded was Control Z, which was about Gen Z voting. Gen Z is not waiting for anybody. Those of you at Cornell University, you know your students, they're not waiting around for anybody, because they've seen what waiting and incrementalism does. So it's a time to, like, get on board and go where they're headed, or you're gonna get left behind, and we continue to fight these insurrectionists, or we're gonna say, all right, we're willing to be led differently.
All right. Unfortunately, that was incredible, but we're out of time. I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague, David Bateman, who will just say a few closing words, and then we all get to go and eat dinner or do whatever else we're going to do. Thank you so much to everyone for being here with us today.
This was just a wonderful event, and we really want to thank everyone for being here with us. It was extremely informative. And to the audience, we really valued your questions, and we regret that there is just no way that we could get to all of them. So on behalf of Price, we would like to thank all of you for participating in this part of the Belknap Family Lefebvre Lowy Presidential Forum. We also want to encourage you to check out Opportunity Pack, which has been organized by Shasti Conrad, as well as the books by Elia Calderon and Cheryl Laird. The links are in the chat. I'm putting them in there right now. Hold on one second as I sort of manage this. There you go. So this is just one event that the Price Initiative is going to be holding over the course of 2021. So we would encourage you all to follow us at Price Initiative on Twitter. I will also put that link in. And to take a look at our website, as whenever you can, for upcoming events. So we want to thank you all very much for being here, and we wish you all a joyous and a better new year. Take care.